Welcome to the Wanderer's History Podcast and to a new episode looking at accounts of travelers in the 16th century Mediterranean. In our next chapter from Cobham's Excerpta Cypria, we look at the account of Chritophori Fureri, who the author says that he was, quote, a man of distinguished lineage and some learning, was born at Nuremberg in 1541, began his travels at 21, and died in 1610. His visit to Cyprus extended from March 29th to May 7th. Cobham also notes in the introduction of this text by saying, quote, Chritophori Fureri ab Heimdorf, Equitis Aurati Itinerarium was published in Nuremberg in 1621 with a fine portrait of the author, a plate of his arms, and 6 woodcuts of the holy places of Palestine. A German version was published in Nuremberg in 1646, is somewhat fuller than the Latin text. End of quote. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you to please hit that subscribe button and notification bell. It really does help the channel a lot. Let us now go back to Chritophori Fureri's account of Venetian Cyprus in the spring of 1566. The English translation goes on to say, quote, we left Tripoli at last for Cyprus with a favoring wind, and sailing first past 2 promontories, one of which is called Greco, to the right of it lies Famagusta, and the other St. George. On March 29th, we approached the island on its southern side and landed at the port of Salines, where we gave thanks to God, the best and greatest, for that he had brought us back safe and sound from the lands of the infidel to a Christian country, for at the time Cyprus was still subject to the Venetians. Just to make a note here, this is a text written in the second half of the 16th century at a time when tensions especially between the Ottomans and most of Western Europe and parts of Eastern Europe for that matter as well, were high. He mentions that Cyprus, particularly at that time, was still subject to Venetian law and a part of the Venetian Commonwealth. Of course, after 1571, it goes to the Ottomans. So I would just like to point out that these texts contain language from that time, and they're in no way representative of any of my opinions or the podcast's opinions and so on and so forth. So this is a text that I am just reading and giving an interpretation on. So coming back to the text, it goes on to say, quote, this island, which is situated in the Gulf of Issus between Cilicia and Syria, was of old called by various people various names. Josephus asserts that it was called Chetima from Chetim, son of Javan and the grandson of Noah. Xenogoras, as we have him in Pliny, called it from its fertility Macaria the Blessed, also Aspelia and Amatusia. Philonides called it Scorastis, Demosthenes Acamantis, Astinomus Cryptos, and Colinia. Furrer notices that besides other fruits, cotton and carobs, which were locust beans, the island was very rich. He goes on to say, quote, the text goes on to say, it was once the seat of 9 kingdoms. Demosthenes, as quoted by Pliny, gives its circuit as 429 miles. Isidorus, 375 miles. Bordone, 3,420 stadia, or 427.5 miles, and 200 miles in length. Of old, it was so given over to luxury that it was deemed sacred to Venus, who was there chiefly worshipped. To her, the Cypriot maidens made offering of their virginity, whereof Justin writes, quote, it was a custom among Cypriots to send their maidens before marriage on certain days to the seashore to seek their dowries, making gain of their virginity and giving it in its stead offerings to Venus. End of quote there. We rested first in a village called Larnica, 2 miles from the port. At no great distance hence is seen the Mount of the Cross, on which they say is preserved the cross upon which hung the penitent thief. On the last day of March, we left Larnica at night, for the intolerable heat made traveling by day impossible, and the following morning we entered Famagusta. It was built on a rock, and though not very large, it is well fortified and has a narrow but safe harbor which is closed by chains and is well suited as an anchorage for light vessels. On the right, it has very charming gardens of citrons, pomegranates, and quinces. As in Egypt, the natives draw the water with which they irrigate the land and which supplies the daily wants of the city by the joint use of oxen and wheels. The city is distinguished by a bishop's see, in whose cathedral dedicated to St. Nicholas lies buried Jacques, the last king of Cyprus. You may read his epitaph on the left of the choir of this church. To Jacques de Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, Cyprus, and Armenia, be praise unstinted for his noble deeds and his triumphs over the enemy. To claim the honors which were refused him, this new Caesar invaded and won the kingdom of Cyprus, took side with the powerful arms of Venice, reduced Amegustus, and united himself in marriage with the daughter Cathelina, a very goddess in beauty. A pious, wise, clement, magnificent, and magnanimous prince, surpassing all in arms and war. Him savage death struck down in the 13th year of his reign and 33rd of his age, and cut off in his cradle his posthumous son, July 6, 1473. Catherine the Venetian queen, his consort, erected the monument. End of that specific quote. The text resumes. On a stone behind the altar you may read these words. Francesco de Prioli, being in command of the Venetian fleet, the banner of St. Mark was happily raised in Cyprus, February 28, 1488. End of quote. This is quite important because this sets up how Cyprus, after 1489, officially becomes part of the Venetian Commonwealth until 1571. Führer goes on to say, quote, there is another church of no great size called St. Maria Hydria, in which on the right hand is preserved one of those water pots in which was the water which Christ at the marriage of Cana in Galilee turned into wine. It is a large earthen pot, one handle of which is completely torn off, while the other is partially broken. Besides these two is a third, the Greek church of St. George, in which you see the marble monument of Epiphanius with a Greek inscription so wasted by age that it cannot be read in its entirety. Somewhere near this church there lived at that time an old man of small stature called Pietro Paolo, who was said to be of the family of the Scaligeri of Verona. At the capture of that city, the Venetians banished him, being yet a boy, to Cyprus, where he was kept for a long time in the castle, but he gained at last leave to wander at his will, but always within the city walls. It had been forbidden him to marry, but by a concubine he begat a son and two daughters, whom he married to two Belgians. One was a doctor of medicine, the other instructed boys in the liberal arts. Both of these, throughout our stay in Famagusta, did us many kind offices. The annual income of the bishop of the city is reckoned at 3,000 golden ducats. Not far from the city is the site of Old Famagusta, or Salamin, in which Paul and Barnabas preached the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some of its ruins can still be seen, as well as a church with the subterranean prison of St. Catherine, which seems to be cut out of the rock. Justin writes thus of Salamis, quote, the Galicians assert that after the close of the Trojan War, Teucer, whom his brother Ajax's death had alienated from his father Telamon, when he was not received in Salamis, retired to Cyprus, and there founded a city bearing the name of his old home. End of quote. On April 8th, we left Famagusta and crossing the very great plain which lies in the middle of the island, bounded by a long string of villages and mountains, we arrived in one day's journey at Nicosia. This is a city of some size and beauty, where lives an archbishop whose annual income reaches, so report goes, the sum of 12,000 golden ducats, and most of the nobles of the island. One can make the circuit of the city in an hour and a quarter. In a monastery of the Franciscans, the body of Saint Francis, a Burgundian knight, is shown in a wooden bier. There is another monastery of the same order in which most of the kings of Cyprus are buried, and right royal are their sepulchres. From the time of the kings of Cyprus, many French nobles live here who still preserve the French costume and enjoy many immunities and privileges. They keep their vassals, who are called barici, in the state of slaves. Some of them are born serfs, some are born free and sold later for certain duties only. A free woman who marries a slave bears slave children. In the Roman law it is different, for the offspring of a free mother and a servile father is born free. A slave cannot marry the female slave of another master, but the nobles themselves pair off their own serfs, unless, and this is a rare case, a master allows a union with another serf when the children belong to the master of the female slave, that the offspring may follow the womb that bare it. The nobles are greatly given to amusements, especially hunting and hawking, and at certain seasons of the year, at Carnival especially, they hold solemn games and banquets with great cost and splendor. In their rules of succession, the eldest brother takes the title and property to the exclusion of his juniors. Nowadays, they mostly marry the daughters of Venetians. At the time we reached the city, the inhabitants were making a great commotion and storming the house of some official because they had discovered that the greatest part of the corn in which the country abounds was being sent out of the island, so that bread was lacking for their daily food. At last, some of the chief nobles came and with soothing words and promises appeased the rioters. In the cathedral church, a certain Venetian lies buried called Carlo Capello. He was remarkable for his knowledge of 3 languages and other attainments, and he came of one of the first families and was a man whose wonderful grace of manner made him generally popular. The Venetians set him to rule, as their custom is, for a term of 2 years the island of Crete, then for 3 years that of Cyprus. During his lifetime, he ordered this epitaph to be inscribed on his tomb. I, Carlo Capello, Knight of the Republic of Venice and Viceroy of Cyprus, bade this shrine be erected for my body, but that my soul shall fly to God I have desired and believed. Hail, ye chosen of God, and win for me by your prayers his boundless mercy. Observations can be made here. In the previous episodes, the travelers and their accounts basically portrayed Famagusta as a very well-maintained, well-kept, economically prosperous settlement in Cyprus, arguably the second most important one after Nicosia, the capital. We see Furer's account describing something that was slowly beginning to boil, the unrest of mainly Greek Cypriots, and we see here the example in which there were riots, especially throughout the 1560s, as the Venetians used Cyprus as a granary, basically, and depleted the island of its resources so they can be sent elsewhere to the terraferma or to Venice. Meanwhile, famines, cataclysms, there was all sorts of incidents, storms, hails, locusts, that sort of thing, made the situation in Cyprus a lot more uncomfortable, especially for the lower classes. And we see here conversations about slaves, about how difficult their life must have been. There's a different clear distinction in wealth and status between the Latins and the Greeks, and Führer gives a very good description of Cyprus. In the concluding paragraphs of this text, he goes on to say, quote, "On April 16th, we left Nicosia, and the next day we reached Limisso, a considerable village with a sea, the income of which is 3,000 ducats, and a castle of which the ruins are visible. On April 25th, 2 hours after sunset, we left the shore of Cyprus in a Venetian vessel, which was reckoned one of the chief and largest of its times, with more than 200 persons in our company. And about noon next day, we reached the city of Paphos, where Paul and Barnabas exposed in a marvelous way the fraud and malice of one Elymas, and won the proconsul Sergius to Christ. This city also has a bishopric with an estimated revenue of 3,000 ducats. On May 7th, we left Paphos and 4 days later got into the Attilic Gulf. End of quote and end of this text. All in all, a very interesting one. 1566, of course, was less than 5 years before the outbreak of the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War. We see differences between Nicosia and Famagusta. We notice that Cyprus itself, apart from these cities, was full of small villages, mostly with farmers and fishermen. And it portrays a very tense situation that this kingdom found itself in. A kingdom stuck in its old ways before the Venetian rule of the Lusignan kings, now with a Venetian rule that was getting complacent of the obvious tensions and quite dire economic situation of most of the population in Cyprus, which of course partially led to the discontent of a large part of the Cypriot population when the Ottomans decided to invade in 1570. All in all, I find this to be a remarkable text, and it offers quite an interesting tableau and a historical image of Cyprus in 1566. I hope you enjoyed this episode and this text. Please remember to subscribe, hit a notification bell if you haven't done so already. It helps the channel a lot. And until the next time, all the best.